Welcome to Vertical City. I'm your host, Lennon Richardson. During each episode, I interview one of the world's top experts in architecture, urban design, engineering, or ecology so that we can better understand and develop solutions for sustainable living. Thank you for listening, and get ready to join us on another groundbreaking and uplifting episode. Mark Lakeman is a national leader in the development of sustainable public places and has influenced the development of more than 300 new community-generated public places in Portland, Oregon alone. Mark is the founder of Portland's Last Thursday Arts Collaboratory and Communitecture, a full-service design firm for both commercial and residential projects. He is also the co-founder of the Planet Repair Institute, the Village Building Convergence, and the City Repair Project, all of which are placemaking organizations based out of Portland, Oregon. Mark is a Portland native and a graduate from the University of Oregon with a degree in architecture. In this interview, we discuss the importance of placemaking and how communities do this, how Portlanders built Pioneer Courthouse Square and the major impacts this continues to have, the Roman grid system versus geomorphic developments, the 6 essential ingredients for a thriving community, and how all of these ideas relate to vertical cities. As always, links and show notes are available by visiting verticalcity.org/podcast. All right, Mark. Well, welcome to the Vertical City podcast.
Thanks, Lennon. It's great to be here.
Thank you for being here. I'd like to just start by having you introduce yourself a little bit and explain what you're currently working on with the Building Convergence Convention. Did I say that right?
Village Building Convergence.
Convergence. I knew I messed it up. All right. Well, we'll get it eventually.
There are 3 long words there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going into our 16th year with the City Repair Project that organizes this annual. You might call it a placemaking festival, but I really like to call it the return of the barn raising.
Okay.
So we're in our 16th year of bringing people together all across the city to do things that they've identified are important to do in their community. And then for 10 days, they build stuff. But it's more than that. First of all, the whole process starts in September. Lots with the release of a request for proposals.
Okay.
And then people talk about this all through the holidays about what kind of projects they want to do in their communities. And then in mid-January, all of the RFPs come back, all of the proposals come back. And we're looking at about 45 projects that we're coordinating simultaneously. And they're distributed all across the geography of the city, mostly on the east side, but there's a few on the west side every year. And these projects are kind of various different scales, but they all act as a catalyst for a village building or barn raising like effect. Every one of these projects is something where people are saying, okay, we want to do this thing, and we want to bring lots of people together to do it. And so how the hell do we do that? Because most people don't know how to organize or even ask for help. I mean, the average American doesn't know how to even ask for help, much less listen to other people very effectively. So these are ways for people to learn how to network in their community, figure out how to tap into the endless bank of skills and talents that reside in every neighborhood, bring people outside together to occupy public space in a not a new way, actually quite an old way, to talk with each other and figure out what they want to do, and then to come out and not just build a thing, like that's part of the festival is where we're actually building, but to get the kids involved, to bring people together who can, mentor other people, who know how to cook, who know how to play music. So it's a full spectrum festival, but it's happening all across the city in more than 40 locations, but all at the same time.
Wow. Yeah. So every proposal that comes out does it become a part of the program?
Yeah, we never turn anyone away.
That's amazing.
But if people don't go the distance, it's only because they end up figuring that they don't have the capacity.
So these are people who have some idea of how they can make their specific neighborhood or their specific community better, and they don't know exactly how to make it happen. So they're coming to you and getting help.
Yeah.
That's really amazing.
Like, and there's a lot of things that we do to help them, but to me, it's really just helping them realize that they already have all the skills and talents that they need all around them, but they don't know it yet. And this is, we were talking earlier about social isolation in American communities. Most people say hello to someone across the street. They might know their name. Maybe some people their children play together, or they might do things occasionally, barbecue or have a block party, but that's usually the extent of it. And that's very, very different than the places with both the lowest crime rates in the world and the highest indicators of public health. I'm talking about villages in other countries.
Okay.
And Americans love to travel to go visit. And we visit there and we want to stay there. Like, say, I just want to go to a Greek village and live for a while and have
Sounds
a sense
good.
of simplicity and beauty, and walk outside and see the mobile market that comes every Wednesday afternoon, and watch the old ladies and eat the local food. And like, okay, that's beautiful. But that all exists because people at a local level do stuff together.
Mm-hmm.
There's intergenerational networks, and there's a lot of reasons why they're place-based, and they're not perfect either, but they're way more advanced in many ways than a modern American community that doesn't have that kind of dynamism and isn't characterized by public spaces where people talk to each other, because the typical neighborhood doesn't even have one. So what we do in the Village Building Convergence is make a distinction between the fact that Americans live in developments where developers decide what's going to be there and what isn't, as opposed to villages where all the villagers decide, not always in a perfect way, not always in an egalitarian way, but they figure out how to meet their needs. And that always includes, like for Italians, that includes a piazza, at least one in every village, more like 38 in my favorite village, which is the same size as my neighborhood in Portland that doesn't have one.
Wow.
So, yeah, there's huge differences. And the main difference is we live in places that we consume as products. And the places of our ancestors, the places where we really formed as humans, where we developed human culture, are characterized by a dynamism that is created from people who live right there. And so that's why you'll find that they have such places are infused with gathering places and all kinds of overlap of people's mutual concerns and lives. They get out and they walk more often. They're not beset by the same public health issues that we have, and they certainly aren't as violent to each other as we are in this country.
So I'm getting two key takeaways from those remarks that you just made. One being that we don't have the places here, and two, that we're also not participating like we used to in the past, we as humanity, and that some people are doing around the world, and that because we're A, not participating, and B, not having the places to come together as community, that we're having all these runoff effects.
Yeah. We have created our own problems. We have actually designed our own isolation. And because I work on the issue of homelessness a lot, as a kind of a design support person, like, if a homeless community in any part of the country calls me and says, we need help and we can't find a local architect to support us, I'll fly there and sit with them and figure out how to propose a concept that is supportable by their city council. And we'll draw it, we'll render it, but it'll all be an expression of the dialogue that those people have with each other. So, as a designer, I see that my role is to be a facilitator of other people's creative engagement, because placemaking needs to result in such a deep connection between people and the environments that they inhabit that they really see themselves as living in their own story. That reminds me, of Shakespeare's famous notion of the theater of life, that we're all on this stage. Sometimes we're the actor, sometimes we're the observer. But in the theater of life, you need to inhabit your own story and not just be not just a passive observer, certainly not a passive consumer. But if we're going to inhabit our own theaters of life, that we have to be integral to the environments where we live.
So if I'm understanding correctly, take, for example, I know that you guys do a lot of painting of intersections. If my community comes together and we decide that we want to do this beautiful mural in the middle of the street, and we pull elements, like maybe there's something symbolic about that place, and so that becomes an image within that element, then now we're invoking a sense of pride because we have this story to tell and it's meaningful, whereas a normal intersection is just something. There's not really much remarkable to talk about, and therefore we don't identify with it. Yeah,
exactly. Well, there's a couple of points to make. First of all, Portland, Oregon began with the great painting of the 2-story rooftop of the Meyer and Frank parking garage.
Okay.
When Mayor Ivancy very stupidly said publicly, I'm not going to let you create that public square because if I do, you'll gather.
Okay.
This is absolutely absurd. But, it's a fact of history that a lot of people already understand that public space is perceived by some to be a political issue. Most of us think, we have freedom of assembly, and we don't realize that we have almost nowhere to assemble.
Sure.
That sort of defeats the point. And for others, public assembly is considered to be dangerous to the established order, which I just think is really too bad, because in the countries where you see that it at work, it facilitates an equilibrium in the community, and without it, there's just endemic distress all the time. So, on one hand, Portland's public square began with a great painting of this rooftop, and that was to focus attention by the public. You had the news media swirling overheads with helicopters, and to try to kind of turn the tide against the.
When was this?
The painting of the rooftop was probably late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about the fact that all of the bricks in Pioneer Square have names impressed on them because the mayor was trying to pull the funding from the square, and the strategy then was to sell every brick. Like every Portlander could contribute money in order to, fund the square by putting their name on a brick. So that's why it's just this lovely story. But more deep than even that story, the foundational principle of urbanity itself is that villages emerge at the convergence of pathways.
Okay, yeah.
You're out there looking for water, and there's going to be some sort of intersection at that water because all these pathways are going to come to it. It's going to turn out to be a trading location, depending on where you are. It is most likely going to develop into a village or something like that. And so what we see in the grid of Portland, which is the same grid, it really is in so many ways as Seattle. I mean, institutionally, they were all mandated at the same moment in 1785. The problem of the Roman grid that underlies the United States is that those locations are nullified and turned into just traffic corridors, and they don't get to become the great village square of every community. So the strategy that we're working on in the Village Building Convergence is to question the idea that we're powerless and to say, no, everyone has power. It's absurd to say that someone else can have your power. And at the local level, if you do have your power and you do say, if you do recognize that freedom of assembly depends on a place to assemble, and you look at the primordial function of the convergence of pathways, you can stand outside your own door and say, as we did in the first case where we painted an intersection, we said, oh my God, that is supposed to be the location that brings us together, because that's where our lives come together. I mean, I think it's very interesting that that's where most traffic accidents happen, because people will converge there one way or another. If it's a place that facilitates communication, people will meet there and build friendships. If you nullify it and just make it into a traffic corridor, the fact that people smash into each other there is still recognizing the fact that it's a place of convergence. It's just become dystopic. So
in the cities that exist, we obviously need these intersections for transportation of our vehicles. What do you propose would take the place of those, or as the community space, if we're not able to have the community space right there in the middle of the intersection?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the answer that we're working on in Portland is that we've actually legalized the transformation of street spaces. But if people can't do that, then they're faced with the challenge of fundraising and trying to purchase an adjacent site. But then that's within the cycle of taxation. So the community always has to figure out a way to support the space economically. The beautiful thing about just simply transforming existing public space is that it already belongs to all of us. And all that we do by saying that it's now a people space is you're saying, we're going to give this a broader diversity of uses. We're going to say that sometimes it's for cars, and sometimes it's for people. And sometimes it's for both, because on the corners you can always have creative activities happening, even when there's cars coming
on
through.
the sidewalks.
Yeah. So that's what the ordinance in Portland allows. The intersection repair ordinance allows every single neighborhood to transform as many street intersections into public squares as people want to do for free.
And then what happens when they're transformed? Do you sometimes shut the roads down and have a little gathering there?
Yeah, if people want to install something in the streets, all they have to do is get a block party permit, and these days they're free.
Wow.
In fact, I think there's never been a suable moment in any block party in the city, because as part of a funding sort of savings measure, about 4 years ago, I think the city stopped requiring people to have insurance for their block parties, because they were like, why even maintain a program when everything gets better because people are having a block party? Like, issues are reduced, strife goes down because people are talking to each other. The danger is not having the block party. We should have insurance for not having a block party, because when you do, people don't hurt themselves. They're like more attentive to each other, and less goes wrong in the neighborhood. So, I mean, such locations that frequently have block parties are definitely they call police measurably less often, and also they don't call for things like conflict resolution. So these are ways
that makes
to
sense.
measure.
Yeah, I mean, if I do have an issue with my neighbor, and I don't know who they are, I don't know if they're a good person or a bad person, maybe I just call the cops on them. But if I've met them at the block party and I know they're a reasonable person, I can just go over there and knock on their door, and we can hash this out ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, by having a relationship to people, you know their name, you know where they live, you've already maybe talked with them, so you know that they're receptive. I mean, maybe you've even talked about some of these kinds of issues. So when you approach them, they're not going to be reactive because they consider you a friend. You know?
Yeah. Especially if you went and painted the mural together, right? Because then you have this common interest. You've done something together.
Yeah, exactly. You sit down together, you have a little potluck, you start talking about a design, and you work through the design together. Presumably, one person's buying the brushes and another person's getting the pressure washer together to clean the street, and everybody's kind of playing their role. And on the day that you actually install this feature, you really see the village come alive. Like, there are these theorists that say that, like Carl Jung, for instance, that would say that there are all these archetypes of different kinds of people. Mm-hmm. Every village has to consist of sort of a certain spectrum of kinds of people, and they can't all be the same. Some people need to be initiators, some are sustainers, some are maintainers, some are nurturers, and they all fit together. But in the American context, we don't even know who's out there because we don't talk to each other, and we certainly don't work together. This is another issue that, is really an interesting thing to think about with respect to vertical cities, because in the American neighborhood, we are zoned so that living is over here and working is over here.
Yeah.
So the disintegration of living and working actually disempowers communities, because when you live and work in the same place, you build more full spectrum relationships.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if everyone just leaves the neighborhood at the start of the day, they never have a chance to do anything that builds common bonds.
That really totally makes sense. I can think of times when I was commuting to work, and I definitely would have more of a relationship with my colleagues than I would with any of my neighbors, just because we're spending 8 hours a day with each other. And so I would maybe have a sense of pride for that group, whatever organization it was I was working for, but would experience very little, if any, pride for my community where I'm actually living.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating?
Yeah.
My father, who's a planner, recently we were having dinner, and he said, you know what I've realized? The disintegration of to take the father away, like, typically up until more recently, last few decades, it's been the father who's gone away from the home to earn the livelihood, right? To actually look at how planning takes a father, planning does this to families all across the country. It takes us men away from our families during the day. And what it structurally does is create a generation gap, because we're not mentoring our own children anymore. Mm-hmm. We have to leave and go off and be away from the family. And as we know, that breaks down our relationship, not just from our kids. It breaks down our relationship with our spouse. And she's unhappy because she's isolated at home, and she doesn't have a village of women to do things together and to support each other during the day. So it actually functionally creates generation gaps and misunderstanding and broken, like, it really stresses families, not just because of the zoning, but because of the lack of gathering places and the fact that everyone's told that where you live, you have no power. All you have to do is go to Guatemala or something and see a village where the women are all working together during the day, like sharing the burden of childcare, doing all the things that they do together, but as teams, and you watch them go as an entire community to go and wash clothes together, and that togetherness really sustains them through everything that they do. The men are off probably working in the fields, and there's a lot of overlap of roles as well. But you can go and observe basically an essential human pattern of community that I think, us, so-called first worlders, with all the advantages we supposedly have, we are actually aching in our hearts to have again. I think this is why, when college students go away on like an exchange program to Africa and they come back absolutely transformed for the rest of their lives because they got to be in a village and see this kind of stuff. It changes their political point of view for sure, and it changes their orientation about how they want to, what kind of job they want to have in their lives. It probably makes them more worldly and makes them want to travel more often. But just to get out and get a little bit of a stereoscopic vision on humanity, like, whoa, things can be so different. I thought everyone was the same in the world because I grew up in an American neighborhood and I didn't know anything about, cultural diversity. But then they travel and come back and they're never the same.
That is, yeah, I can definitely agree with that. My travels have opened my eyes to things that I never even considered would exist. One example is something that came up when we were talking just briefly over lunch, and you mentioned it briefly, which is the Roman grid system. And I found that conversation was really interesting. And so I would like, if you wouldn't mind, just to explain to our listeners how that system came to be and why it's still in place.
Well, it's interesting that we even have to talk about it because I'm excited to talk about it, but it's interesting to me that we have to because it's everywhere. You would think that the fact that the grid is everywhere, especially in North America, South America, basically anywhere where someone has colonized someone else's space, the grid is really always used as the development pattern for expansionism.
Yeah, I just assumed it existed because it was like the most efficient way to do things.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly, I want to say I really admire the goals and objectives and priorities of new urbanism, because they talk about walkable, talkable communities.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, then, they think that leads to the use of the colonial grid. But the impact of the grid on an ecological, on a landscape, basically it erases the patterns, the ecological patterns of a place. The grid is installed without respect to slope. It doesn't care how water flows. It facilitates development patterns that, with architecture that isn't even paying attention to where light is coming from. It's actually quite absurd, and yet it is all over the place. And I want to say a little bit more about new urbanists, because anybody listening to this who is a new urbanist will say, now, hold on just a second. This is what they always say. If we don't have the grid, then what do you want? Suburban cul-de-sacs? Any planner who's listening to this right now who says that to themselves, call me up and we'll have lunch and we can talk and I can remind you of the great urbanists that we all had to study in planning school that taught us that you could have walkable, talkable communities and place. Like Camilo Cite, who wrote the City Artistically Considered, is like the grandfather of urban planning and placemaking. And he absolutely refuted the grid. And he was just pointing out to everyone, like, look at how beautiful and walkable and enjoyable and aesthetic these landscapes are that people have inhabited over time and carefully adapted themselves to, not to come in and impose and order a system over the landscape, but to elicit the human habitat out of the landscape itself. And these are the most gorgeous landscapes in the world, where the continuity of inhabitation is, perhaps thousands of years, and the economy tends to be more robust. The people tend to be more healthy because they're out walking and talking all the time. There's a measurable qualitative difference. And new urbanists, because their reference point is the USA, they just think it's either suburban sprawl or the colonial grid. And what they don't realize is rejecting the colonial grid and choosing the suburbs is what we've already done. Returning to the grid is just going to lead to its rejection in an attempt to have more space, open space, contact with nature, better air, which is why people chose the suburbs to begin with. Mm-hmm. But neither one of them do what we really want, which is kind of all that together. So The third way, or the best way, or the way that most people on the planet still live, actually, is in a geomorphic form. If we're talking about sustainability, we want to be geomorphic because it means that we're adapting to our environment rather than forcing it to serve us.
Sure. Which seems to be sort of a common thing that we as humans tend to do, is we try to take nature and then make it work for us without realizing that nature is more efficient than anything than we could ever be. And so my belief personally is that by just aligning with nature, that we become more efficient ourselves.
Yeah.
So explain more about this term of geomorphic. How does that work in these communities where they're not, sectioning up the entire city and saying this road goes here and this road goes here? How do these villages or larger establishments evolve?
The story is kind of different in every context, I think. One of the most famous examples, of course, is like a medieval town that is always a geomorphic settlement, but then it's surrounded by kind of a distinct perimeter, almost like an urban growth boundary.
Okay.
Because that was their fortified wall, and they
Sure.
were safe inside of that, and then they preserved the farmland around them because that was their food source. But they did, in every one of those cases, they would not just sort of start off and say, okay, here's the ultimate form of what we're going to create, and then they would just create this fortified town. They had to create the fortifications because of the dynamics going on between, kind of competing cultures that
Sure.
were close to each other. But they start off, like Siena is one of my favorite examples. Siena arose because people were trading, and they were traveling between Pisa, Milan, Rome, and Florence.
Okay.
And the pathways all met at this great south-facing meadow in the Tuscan hills. And because of all the trading and interacting happening at that intersection, like that convergence point, the village of Siena started to grow up around the perimeter of the meadow. And the Piazza del Campo, which is that meadow, it actually means the mountain meadow.
Huh.
So they preserved the meadow because that was the great place that, was the reason why the village even began, or even started. So the whole thing emerges around it as a fabric of many, many, many intersections of convergence. And in the meadow, there's this spectacular feature, which is that on the south edge, there's the public plaza or Palazzo Pubblico. It basically is the meeting house of the community.
Okay.
And there's a great tower that rises out of it, and it casts a shadow across the face of the meadow, which is now, a paved piazza. But this shadow is cast across it, and it acts like a great sundial. And the shadow's, of course, short in the summer and longer in the winter. And they, the people who live there, the 15 or 20,000 people that live in the village, they actually know what time of season or day it is. It's like this cosmological device, the great gathering place of the community, that casts the shadow that tells you, oh, well, it's the equinox today, or it's the solstice, the winter solstice, because the summer, the shadow is as long as it can get, and it's touching this one spot, which tells us it's noon.
Huh.
You're like living within a gigantic cosmological medieval/village thing. So they emerge because of our behavior. That's the beautiful thing. Like Siena is an expression of behavior over time. And the fact that it's made out of this beautiful brick, that is where we get the word Siena, the color, is because they just dug it out of the ground right there. So the thing, as an expression of place, is telling the story of the region, of the movement patterns of people, the fact that they're a node in a network that includes these other outlying towns, and the function of trading, that led to this urbanity and this density.
That's a really neat example. So what do we do here in the West and other places where we're already developed? We already have the grid. I mean, this system is in place. It's not like we're going to get rid of it.
Yeah.
How do we improve upon it? Is it doing these village placemaking? Is that the number one strategy, or?
Yeah. Well, I actually do think so, because my definition of placemaking is it infers something about decompartmentalizing. I would say that my diagnosis of Portland's problems would be similar to Los Angeles's and Seattle, and it's a little different in each case because of scale and climate and stuff and history. But at the same time, the fact that we are all created as investments, and instead of emerging out of a dynamism of interaction, we basically, like, in the case of Portland, Pettygrove and Lovejoy flipped a coin to decide whether or not we would be called Boston or Portland. It was that arbitrary.
Yeah.
And for them, the whole thing was a development scheme, and they would, they took what was probably a seasonal village location of the Chinook people, and they decided to turn that into a development because everyone had already died because of European diseases and stuff.
Jeez.
So we took what was essentially a village before, an optimal location, and converted it into a commodity and then sold it off. So that was that's our development pattern. So how do we transform that? Because we know that the seed of that activity, that behavior, has led to the society that we're in right now, where we're constantly looking out for ourselves and maybe being exploitive of each other and the natural environment. How do you make that sustainable? The story is it starts off with very little chance to become sustainable because it doesn't begin with trying to figure out ways for people to benefit each other. It's more like a gold rush mentality. So how do we do it? But I think Portland, Oregon is already it already has the answer. Like the fact of the emergence of our public square was a driving impetus. Like there's a driving force in the community of the 60s and 70s to have a gathering place. I think there was a broad realization, and it was led by some pretty radical planners in the city, going out around the city to basically say, hey, here we are. We've been here for 150 years, and there isn't one single public square. Does that help anything?
Right.
So they tried to kind of rally everyone to support the idea of a public square. And of course, the mayor at the time, well, earlier it was Goldschmidt who was supportive. Later on, before it was created, it was Frank Ivensey who tried to stop it. And we transcended that. Like we created the partnership culture that you would find in Siena. We created the partnership culture that I think everyone is dying to inhabit in their own life, where they're part of a network of friends and they have a voice in that and people listen to them. And they are, part of this. Like we walk around asking ourselves, what is the meaning of life? And that does not happen in other places where they're part of networks where your aesthetic experience of being alive is so fulfilling you would never ask such a question because you're just so filled with family, and community, and the pathways you travel every day are beautiful and interesting.
Life has meaning, so you're not asking a question.
Yeah. Like why even, the question wouldn't occur to you in other places. So I think that we've been retrofitting our city like no other city on the continent. We're the only city that has met and exceeded the Kyoto carbon reduction targets in the whole continent. We have the most bike lane miles and the most bike commuters by far. Portlanders every year are measurably driving fewer miles in their cars, and they're walking and they're using other modalities. There's so many things that we're doing in the city because we're the most participatory culture in the entire continent that we have unintended benefits. Like we have the most microbrewery. We're like beer city of the universe now.
Yeah, totally.
Like the planet by broad consensus. We have the most creative music culture. We have the most fertile food culture. We have the shortest distance between where people grow their food and where it's consumed of all cities. That's because, I actually trace this back to Pioneer Square.
That's what I was just going to ask.
It was the catalyst, I think.
Yeah.
It's not just that it brought us together to do a project. It's that we now have this shining, gleaming symbol that basically tells everyone that there's somewhere where everybody belongs, that everyone has access to, or at least that was the message. It was the great public living room.
Yeah.
And I think after 150 years, there's enough pressure that builds up where people need that desperately, that's what's happened to us. There's this healing effect that happened from having it, actually from the work to create it, and then the story that we created it. And we had to fight our own leaders to create it. And I think the fact that we won makes us badass in our own minds.
Totally.
And it gives us the courage to just keep reinventing our culture. That's
really interesting because I was never in Portland before there was a public square. I grew up in Oregon in about 3 hours from here, and I moved to Portland about 8 years ago. And so there's always been Pioneer Square in my mind. And it is certainly one of the things that I'm proud of as a Portlander, even though I didn't have any direct involvement in creating that. Yeah. But it's definitely like what we were talking about earlier, where just the simple thing of painting an intersection creates a sense of pride in your community. And I could see that happening on a much grander scale by actually buying a brick and then having it laid into the center of the city. And that's going to exist forever, hopefully. And then it's a place for us to gather.
Okay, so thinking about the idea of vertical cities and all the reasons why you would want to integrate living and working and shorten the distances that people travel so they don't even have to have cars. All the advantages, all the economies of scale in terms of construction, but also all the potential benefits of having people live more closely together. I'm like, wow, how can we do that in a way that is geomorphic so that those buildings actually respond to the climate and the landscape and our expressions of participation? I think we can do that. How can you, like looking at all the best characteristics of villages, we know what they are. There's 6 essential ingredients.
Okay.
Like if you have those 6 things measurably, according to this guy Kevin Lynch that wrote the book The Image of the City, and it's a foundational text for all urban planners, urban designers. If you have these 6 elements in anything, people will interact and talk with each other more often. We can do that in a vertical city. So they're basically these: a gateway, a thing that says to you, welcome to this badass place. Welcome, and come back soon. Like if you're leaving and you see the gate as you're going, welcome back. This portal is waiting for you to return. Like something. Like even if you go to some, ancient Etruscan village, there's this way that they celebrate the entrance to their village where they're like, we rock.
You're here.
This is your story, and people don't want to move away from a place like that because they're like, this is where my roots are deep.
Uh-huh.
So gateways, portals, and then pathways that people travel. Our pathways are nullified into traffic corridors, even in like tall buildings. It's just like, how do I get from the elevator to my office? And the space in between is just for travel. Why isn't there poetry along the way? Why aren't there pictures? Why aren't people expressing things? Like in the most robust villages, when you travel through that gateway, you're traveling a story that feeds your senses. It's lined and animated with interesting shops and stuff that's like fill the public space and your senses, with the smells of things that people are making and the sights of the things that they've crafted. So the pathways then create the linkage. I mean, they're almost like the way that things travel in our body and link everything together and make it work. So a pathway is a place. It shouldn't just be a corridor for movement. And I think we can do this in a vertical city. In every single system, it can be a more meaningful environment and not just nullified into this reductionist, it costs too much to think about kind of mentality. So then those pathways arrive at nodes, almost like organs in your own body that all have different functions. Sometimes it's an office, sometimes it's a restaurant, sometimes it's a workspace, it's a collaborative space. But those are like organs of the community. And then, of course, you arrive at the great village heart, which is the commons that everybody knows. Like, that's where stuff's going on every night.
Sure.
Or that's where we always get together in times of crisis. And then, of course, the last 2 elements are, the one that's most missing in the USA is places of memory.
Okay.
Like the kind of thing you'd see in Mexico along the side of the road. If you see someone like has died there, they'll memorialize that person. Or in Tibet, you're going along a mountain pass, and you keep coming upon shrines that are trying to remind you that your existence is phenomenal. Like that's the sort of thing that's missing most often in the U.S. because we sort of have this attitude toward public space that it can't be modified by local cultures. If it doesn't fit in the rules, it can't exist, kind of thing. So that's the most profoundly missing thing in our reality. But the 6th thing is that the overall form of the village, if it's comprehensible and it's something you can remember, then your overall sense of that place, has a form. So the 6 parts can, I think, be incorporated into the vertical city. And if they are, then they'll correspond with our physiology and our sensibilities as they've evolved over a million years.
And when these 6 elements exist, that's when a village thrives as a community. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah. Kevin Lynch went around the world looking for the most exemplary villages, and he wanted to, ones that were characterized by the most continuity of people living there, like that they weren't abandoned, but they were inhabited. And then economies that were more stable, that were characterized, a culture that was characterized by less violence and more interactivity and creativity. And then he asked himself, all right, so out of these examples, what are the things that they have in common? Because he was searching for something that is archetypal to humanity. And what he found was this menu of 6 things, like an extremely memorable, describable, aesthetic environment that had all these different pieces. Just imagine living in a landscape where it never celebrates your transition as you're coming and going. It's like, well, ho-hum, all we do is work here.
Yeah.
That's how we live. Like in a neighborhood, you don't even know when you're leaving the Hosford Abernathy neighborhood to go into the Buckman neighborhood. There's no distinction at all.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help you have a cumulative sense of community.
So are there any communities here in Portland that do a really good job and they embody all or most of these elements?
There are some, yeah. I mean, everybody talks about Ladd's Addition as an example because...
It's interesting that that's also not in the traditional grid as well.
Yeah, it sort of makes itself a world apart by having these diagonals, and then it has 4 diamond-shaped rose gardens and then a circular rhododendron garden in the middle. And that circle is an exception in the Portland landscape, for the most part. It's not a distinctly social space. Like, this is the thing. Portlanders have lots of parks.
Yeah.
But until Pioneer Square, we had one public square. And it's the public square that is the social space. It's the park which gets used as a de facto social space, but mostly it's there for recreation and relief and a sense of open space and nature.
Okay.
But you don't necessarily meet people unless you're like, actually, some people have dogs in order to meet other people.
Yeah.
Like, nice dog,
Yeah, the dogs meet each other. Oh, the dogs are smelling each other, so I guess we'll shake hands too.
It gives you a reason to talk to somebody. Yeah. It's a secret strategy. Or like, oh, I've got my kid for the weekend. I'll go out and walk. Maybe I'll meet a nice young lady.
Maybe has a kid too. Totally.
A nice man because I'm taking care of children. People have different strategies. Yeah, the public square and the park are really different things.
So in Ladd's Addition, is there a gateway? Do you know when you're coming and going?
I think that the gateway is a kind of a de facto thing. It's when you shift off of the grid into this. Oh, but it also helps because you suddenly transition into this canopy of elm trees. So that's, this is the thing about ourselves. We're always reading patterns, always. Mm-hmm. Just even to navigate a grocery store aisle, you're navigating patterns and reading it, trying to figure out where you're going. And so we do that all the time. And even if you don't see a gateway, you're looking for a gateway. You're looking for a reference point. And I think that we've gone through a lot of time as hunter-gatherers looking for signposts because we're going off into the unknown and we got to find our way back. So, somebody told you when you see this certain rock, you go around a corner, you're going to be in a valley and there's going to be lots of deer there. So go real slowly and be quiet. But on the way back, you have to travel to get back to your place. Maybe there's rain or snow and you have to have a reference point. Mm-hmm. Like we've been doing that for so long, it's hardwired in us to read the landscape. Whether it's because we're chasing game or just trying to find our way, paying attention to light. Like we're some of that's lost because we don't talk to each other and we don't mentor our children. But a lot of it is just below the surface waiting to be activated, I think. And that's part of what helps us to be placemakers.
So earlier you started to define placemaking. I'm not sure if I caught your full definition.
Well, it's kind of changes from time to time as I learn more, but I would say American culture is characterized by space. We're interested in space a lot of times as a commodity. Like a lot is an unformed commodity. It's an urban lot. You've purchased it, and you want to do something to it. It's not developed yet. It's not good enough as a natural state.
Okay.
It waits for the human hand to become something. Finally, that's our attitude toward the world, and that's space. Space doesn't really have a story yet, I would say. I mean, people talk about public space, but there's a difference between space and place.
Okay.
And I think place is where you've worked with space to turn it into or to elicit a story. And, you could say, well, gosh, architects are doing that all the time. But this is like a revelation, a transitional revelation from 20th century to 21st century. Place is not just architecture. It's not just the fact that you have a place to sit and maybe at best look at, sit in the sun. and watch other people. That's nice, and it can actually develop as a place over time when people use it and they start to have memories there. But if you just walk into an undifferentiated environment where you have no stories or associations, for most people it's not a place yet, until there's a memory. But the best places, I would say, begin with people coming together to talk about how they want to creatively modify the environment together. They figure out what roles they will play, how they will contribute, and so you start to seed this sense of connection to the environment, to the world. And until that's happening, you really just have more. It's more that you have space. But this is a really nuanced discussion. I mean, you can walk into Yosemite that no human being ever sculpted, and it's like, oh my God,
this is an amazing place.
This is a place, and this is where the gods live. So I mean, it's there. There's a lot of times when like the Willamette and the Columbia converge. I mean, this was a big deal for the community of people here before, and it's part of why we're right here.
Yeah.
And so it has this kind of automatically profound, impact. So, I mean, place isn't just stuff that you design and build, but I want to say something more about it. In this mentality we have of just treating the world like raw material, we're doing that within a culture of specialization, and that does not necessarily result in place. A cultural specialization, like the definition of the Western city or the colonial city-state, is that it's characterized by specialization.
Okay.
It doesn't even start with the grid. It's more like human beings are conditioned to be specialized functions in...
I'm a hunter and you're a gatherer.
Yeah. Or I'm a baker and you make shoes.
Okay.
I mean, God, most parties to this day, what do you do for a living? What's your function in the colonial grid? But place in that context is where somebody comes together and says, some group of people comes together and they say, how can we bring all these threads back together into a coherent whole greater than the sum of its parts? I think that's like space in our society is a bunch of individuals separated that are sums, but not a whole. Place is where the sums become whole and where you decompartmentalize the culture so that the musician starts to learn how to cook. The cook starts to learn how to use their hands to make shoes. Everybody, there's this cultural fusion that starts to gel, where everyone starts to affect each other, and specialization breaks down, and we start to become more generalists together. Generalists with areas of strength.
Mm-hmm.
That's an indigenous community. So I think place is the decompartmentalization of the Western city to become an expression of a greater whole. And I think that's sustainable. I think that's also achievable inside of a vertical city as well. It implies some things about how you would design a vertical city. It implies something about the common spaces and the pathways. Your driving goal should be, how do we engender more interaction and communication in the people that inhabit these towers? We're not just stacking them up like they're in an egg crate, because we're already doing that in tall buildings.
Right, and there's really hardly any places to have accidental interactions.
Yeah. So I think that's what we mean by vertical city. It's not just density. It's dynamism and it's vibrance. And it's places and spaces and stories.
Yeah, that's something that the founders of this organization definitely stress, and through their research and interviewing experts from around the world, that this is something that's very fundamental and that's also quite lacking from a lot of our cities. Beautiful. And that's true whether you're in the heart of the city, working in one tower, and maybe for example, your soulmate could be even in that building, but you never meet them because maybe the one place that you do run into each other is in an elevator, and everybody knows you don't talk to somebody in an elevator. It's just part of our culture for some reason. But if you are creating an environment that is invoking these interactions, then that increases your odds of meeting people who end up really benefiting your life.
I think you're right, and especially if that's your design intent. I want to say that years ago when I went on this speaking tour of the East Coast, while I was in New York, I gave a presentation at the Pratt Institute of Design, and I don't know which direction it was or what building it was, but afterwards somebody took me to this apartment building or a condo. I don't know if it was owned or rented, but the people there had created a vertical festival.
Okay.
And you knew it because as you're approaching the building, the lobby was open to the street, and there were people outside on the sidewalks where there were tables and chairs and lots of music and artwork displayed. And we went into the lobby, and the lobby was, again, a performance venue and a gathering place filled with the stuff that the people of the living in the building had brought to the space. That was amazing. I'd never seen that before. But was the most amazing thing were the elevators. You just brought that up, which is what makes me think of this story. So I went into the elevator. There were 3 elevators. Each one had been converted into a vertical bar.
That's awesome.
I walked into the smoothie elevator.
Wow.
Where people had bar stools. A person had set up a little corner bar, and they actually had a blender in the elevator, and they were making smoothies. And, normally you don't walk into an elevator where everyone's standing there with a drink, so having so much fun they're not even getting out.
Yeah.
So the elevator was packed, and I don't know what was being served in the other elevators, but we went up, and we went out into these hallways. The hallways were filled with pictures, and in some cases there were podiums with sculptures and things on them. So people had turned the common spaces into this wonderful, place of creative expression. And then just like, you kind of hear about this, apartments had been turned into different environments, like a roving party where you have orders here. So they were doing that, except a whole lot of the spaces were open, the apartments or whatever were open all over the building with different kinds of things happening in them, like a village. I don't know if there's anything on the roof, but you'd hope that there was something happening on the rooftop too.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, especially like if different spaces are having different functions and you are aware of like, maybe in this apartment they're doing some sort of arts and crafts. Over here they're drinking red wine. I can naturally just go to where my interests are, and then I'm going to meet people who share those same interests.
Yeah. Why should a tall building just be a way of stacking people up for profit? I think you can achieve that, and at the same time, like a developer, why don't they aspire to leave a legacy of some kind? Why not make something more out of what they've created? I don't think it takes a whole lot of effort. But if all they do is like stack it up and they think about, what they're going to make as their bottom line, and then they just sort of hand it off to a management company, like what have they really created? And I mean, for themselves, like what about their sense of satisfaction or their creative experience? I ask myself this over and over again with respect to developers, because I have worked with many of them in my life. And I'm just like, really? Is that all you want to do? Like you don't even care about whether or not people will talk to each other in this environment. You're taught in school and also in the profession of architecture that one of your sort of primary concerns is how to trick a developer into doing something humane.
Oh my gosh.
Like if we could just get a curve in the lobby and paint it peach, or get a skylight. I remember one time in the Bijou Cafe, not too far away from here, this developer walks up to me and he's like, that skylight that you got me to put in is like this suburban office park I helped with. And he's like, you told me it was going to bring light into the center of this very low ceiling but enormous space that was really oppressive and people would really enjoy it. And he's like, so it did all that, but I still wish I had my $300,000 from putting it in.
Wow.
He's like, it did all those things that you wanted it to do, but I still only care about money, and I regret that you tricked me into doing that. And I was like, I cannot help you. I cannot help you. Like, for you to witness that it all came true and somehow you regret, after all the millions you've accumulated, there's $300,000 missing from your portfolio. I'm just like, I don't know what to say.
I'm searching my mind because I had an interview with somebody else earlier, and I can't remember which individual it was, but they were talking about how this is changing. It was an architect, and they were talking about how developers are starting to realize, at least some of them, that these are important because their tenants, the people who want to end up occupying that building, they know that if there is a space that is good for the people, that they're going to have higher worker retention and that they're going to be more profitable. And so often we find that these things that we feel we should do because they're more humane to do actually end up being more profitable because people want to work and support those organizations.
Yeah. And the fact that it works that way, I think is another part of this, of course, this same conversation. People People want to have something to do with other people. They like other people. Isn't it crazy how in our society, like, we on one hand we obviously are desperately concerned with how other people perceive us because of how we dress up or how nervous we are in public speaking or walking across a room where everyone might see us. Like, it obviously really matters to us what other people think. And at the same time, our competition against each other sort of engenders at the same time this crazy mutual loathing. But the thing is that we are absolutely interdependent in spite of all of our attempts to be in denial of that.
Sure.
So I think environments that aren't just things, but places, which means that process and thing are one, they're worthy of us, and they are more supportive of the full spectrum, kind of our nature. Like, not just to work all the time, but to feel all the time. I personally feel that every single place where people are finding themselves with other people should be conducive to interaction and communication, and should be, like, even
drawing that out of us.
Yeah, it should be supportive in everywhere.
That's excellent. This has been a really awesome conversation that we had, and I want to keep going. I have so many more questions, but we only have just a few minutes left, and so I want to take that time to open it up to you. If you have anything that's really near and dear to your heart that you want to express that you haven't had the opportunity to express, or if you have a call to action, something you want to inspire our listeners to do, then this is your time.
Well, I certainly would invite everyone to participate in the Village Building Convergence. And what that means is, it literally means anything. Like, if there's a thing that people feel is important to be accomplished, and they need help to do it, that's village building. To reach out and ask for that help, to receive the help. But you have to be doing something that is coming from the intent to benefit everyone mutually, where everyone gets to contribute and also receive something. That's village building. So the Village Building Convergence in Portland, you can find it at, I believe, at villagebuildingconvergence.com or .net or .org. I can't remember, but
we'll post the link in our show notes on our website as well.
Okay, that's great. So even if you don't want to do a project, if you just come, and people are coming from all over the world, all over the continent, to come to this thing and see what in the world is going on. In fact, we're training people from everywhere. They come to Portland, they train, and then they go back to their town to try to start these things happening where they live. So if people just want to come and see how it works, that's easy, because all the daytime workshops, the 45 workshops across the city, those are all free. And then at night, there's this kind of 10-day festival of speaking, and it's really just a village of all kinds of different interactive experiences. There's always that, and that happens in the evening. And this is June 3rd to June 12th this year. That's just one form. Personally, I am so passionate and so connected to people, different communities in Portland. I'm working on village building a lot of different forms. On Thursday, City Council is going to approve the relocation of R2D2, the village downtown, the homeless village. Yeah, and we could talk about this for hours, but in my opinion, R2D2 is going to help in its own way to change the world. It's going to prove things about the power of democracy, and for people who are afraid of it or think like, oh no, homeless people, a bunch of anarchists are going to take over the world, they're missing the point. What this thing is doing is offering the whole Portland community the opportunity to witness so much of what we talked about today. People coming together and creating a geomorphic expression. And really what's been going on for the last 4 years, and then as of Thursday in fast mode, it's restating kind of a lot of the ways that we even developed human culture and civilization. People coming together and finding each other, starting to figure out systems and invisible structures of self-governance and co-responsibility, and then that taking an urban form. This is a fascinating thing, and it should not be opposed by anybody. But if anybody's feeling like opposing it, my response to them is get involved, because you don't know what's going on. If you're opposing this, you don't know what's going on. And this is just one story in Portland. I mean, there are people innovating across our landscape. Like, I don't think there's been a more fertile culture, maybe in the world, than what we have going on here now.
I certainly have a sense of pride of being here myself. Well, thank you again for joining us on the podcast. This has been very excellent.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Vertical City. Learn more about the Vertical City concept and continue the conversation by visiting our website, verticalcity.org. I truly hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe to our podcast, leave a review on iTunes, and most importantly, share Vertical City with your friends and colleagues so that together we can create solutions for sustainable living. I'm Lennon Richardson, signing off for the Vertical City team. See you next time.